Have you ever been so desperate for acceptance that you were willing to make a deal with God? So desperate that you'd place the one pure thing you truly loved on the altar? This isn't a rhetorical question. It's the story of a man whose thirst to be seen, to be validated, led him to make a vow that would echo in silence and grief for all time. A vow that heaven heard but did not stop. The man's name was Jephthah, and his story begins with a wound, a slur hurled like a stone that shattered his childhood. Bastard. He was the son of Gilead, yes, but his mother was a prostitute, a detail his half-brothers never let him forget. They threw him out of the family, cut him off from his inheritance, with the kind of contempt reserved for the unclean, and the town elders did nothing. Jephthah learned his first lesson right there, in the dust of the road as he turned his back on his home. Belonging had a price, and he couldn't afford it. He fled to the land of Tob, a lawless frontier that became his kingdom. The wilderness, with its brutal honesty, was a kinder teacher than his family had ever been. There, among a crew of misfits and men with hearts as scarred as his own, he became a leader. His strength wasn't just physical. It was the strength of a man with nothing left to lose. In Tob, he was respected. But respect from the outcasts couldn't soothe the sting of rejection from the righteous. This open wound shaped his faith. To Jephthah, God wasn't a father. The only father figure he'd known had discarded him. God was a powerful sovereign, a warlord king with whom you made alliances, not prayers. Faith was a transaction, a contract. You offer loyalty and sacrifice, and he offers victory. It was the only language life had taught him. It was with this calculating, wounded heart that he saw one day a dust cloud approaching his camp, a cloud coming from the direction of Gilead. Before we find out who these travelers were and what they wanted, I'd love to know where in the world you're connecting with this story from. It's an incredible thing to see our community grow, and to know these words are finding a home in so many hearts. Drop a comment below. I'd be thrilled to read it. Brace yourself, because Jephthah's journey teaches us something profound about the consequences of our desperate bargains, and about finding strength even when we feel broken. You're about to see how the wounds of rejection can drive us to life-altering decisions, and how even in the midst of pain, there is a path to overcoming. Let's dive into this story. From the dust emerged the elders of Gilead. The same men who had silently watched his humiliation now bowed before him, their dignity eroded by panic. Their faces, once hard and impassive, were etched with defeat. The Ammonites, Israel's enemies, were crushing their towns, and Gilead's army was no match for them. The nation that had cast out its bastard son now needed its most feared warrior. Jephthah watched them approach, a cold fire in his veins. Every step they took toward him was a small, bitter victory. He could taste the metallic tang of contempt in his mouth, mixed with a dark triumph that shamed him. Here they were, the men of God, the pillars of the community, begging the unclean one for help. His mind, forged in the art of the deal, immediately saw the opening. This wasn't a visit, it was an offer. Jephthah, the lead elder said, his voice thick with urgency, be our commander, lead us against the Ammonites and save us. The offer was blunt, stripped of the honor they should have given him years ago. It was the plea of a drowning man who doesn't care who throws him the rope. A short, humorless laugh cut the air. Jephthah rose, his presence filling the space. So now you come to me? His voice was low, but every word was an indictment. Weren't you the ones who hated me? Who drove me from my father's house like a stray dog? Why is yesterday's trash today's last hope? The questions hung there, and none of them dared to answer. He stepped forward, the negotiator taking over from the wounded son. All right, I'll go. I'll fight for you. A sigh of relief rippled through the group, but Jephthah held up a hand, silencing them. But we're going to have terms. If the Lord gives me victory over the Ammonites, I won't just be your commander for the war. I will be your head, your leader, over all of Gilead. He wasn't asking. He was dictating the terms of his return. The elders, backed into a corner, sealed the pact right there, with heaven as their witness. Jephthah had won his homecoming, but by turning his people's salvation into a contract, he opened a dangerous door in his own soul, one that would soon demand a terrible payment. The journey back to Gilead was quiet. Jephthah rode ahead of his men, not like a conquering general, but like a ghost returning to his own grave. Every palm tree, every hill, every well was a memory. He saw the faces of the kids he'd grown up with, now men who eyed him with a mix of fear and hope. He saw the shadows of his brothers on every street corner. The air of his homeland felt heavier, more suffocating than the dust of the badlands of Tob. He wasn't coming home. He was returning to the scene of the crime of his own birth. True to his new role as leader, and perhaps to prove to himself he was more than a brute, his first move wasn't to draw the sword. It was to send messengers. He dispatched envoys to the Ammonite king with a simple, direct question. "What is this dispute between us, that you have come to wage war in my land?" He argued with history, citing Israel's journey, the lands God had granted them 300 years prior. He offered peace, extended the hand of diplomacy. It was a test, not just for the enemy king, but for himself. The answer came like a slap in the face. The Ammonite king replied with arrogance, twisting history, claiming the lands as his own and demanding their return. The door to peace was slammed shut. For Jephthah, that rejection from a pagan king echoed every other rejection of his life. From his brothers, his father, his people. A cold fire ignited within him. If peace couldn't be negotiated, then war would be total. The inevitability of the conflict weighed on him like a sentence. He gathered the men of Gilead and Manasseh. As he passed through Mizpah, the very place where the pact had been made, he felt the weight of command in a new and terrifying way. Leading outcasts on quick raids was one thing. Carrying the fate of an entire nation on your shoulders was another. He felt everyone's eyes on him, but above all, he felt the eyes of God. And it wasn't a look of comfort. It was the stare of a harsh judge, waiting to see if the son of a whore was up to the task, if he was worthy, or if he would finally fail, to everyone's shame. That night, on the eve of battle, the silence of the camp was a torment. The campfires crackled, the men slept, but Jephthah was wide awake, fighting the real war inside his own soul. The confidence he projected was a mask. Inside, fear was eating him alive. What if God doesn't answer? What if the Lord, in the end, also sees me as unclean, unworthy of his intervention? The doubt was a poison, and his transactional faith screamed that he needed collateral. He needed to force God's hand. It was then, in the crucible of his desperation, that he stood and looked up at the indifferent stars. His voice was a hoarse whisper, a prayer born not of piety, but of sheer panic. "Lord," he said, "if you truly give the Ammonites into my hands, then it shall be that whatever comes out of the door of my house to meet me when I return in peace shall be the Lord's, and I will offer it up as a burnt offering." The words hung in the cold night air, terrible and irrevocable. There was no thunder, no angel stayed his tongue, there was only silence, a deep, heavy silence that seemed to swallow his desperate offer. He felt a chill that wasn't from the wind. It was the cold of a line that had been crossed, of a pact sealed in darkness, with no witness but the God he was trying to coerce. The uncertainty was agony. Was the deal accepted, or was he terrifyingly alone? How many of us, in a moment of panic, have made desperate promises to God? If you've ever felt the weight of a word you couldn't take back, of a bargain made in the dark, know that you're not alone. This is the power and the peril of our faith when it's driven by fear and not by trust. Jephthah's story shows us just how high the price can be. At dawn the army marched. Jephthah rode at the front, his face a mask of iron. No one could see the secret stone he carried in his heart, the weight of the vow that both propelled and haunted him. And then the Spirit of the Lord came upon him. In the battle he was not a man, but a storm. The victory over the Ammonites was staggering, more complete than he had dared to dream. 20 towns fell before him. God had kept his end of the bargain. But as his men shouted his name in triumph, the sound reached his ears like a distant echo. Standing on the field of victory, surrounded by death and celebration, Jephthah didn't feel the euphoria of the conqueror. He felt only the ice of anticipation. The external war was over. The internal one was about to reach its devastating climax. The journey back to his home in Mizpah, which should have been his crowning glory, had become a death march. Victory wasn't the end. It was the beginning of his true tragedy. The march back to Mizpah was a silent torture. The euphoric soldiers sang songs of victory, but to Jephthah, their joyous shouts sounded like accusations. The landscape of Gilead, which should have been the stage for his consecration, now felt like an open-air courtroom. Every hill they crested, every valley they crossed, brought him closer to the moment his desperate bill would come due. The sun shining in the sky seemed to mock the darkness that had settled in his soul. To keep from thinking of the terror that awaited him, his mind sought refuge in the one image that brought him peace, his daughter's face. She was his only heir, not to land or riches, but to all the love his hardened heart could feel. He remembered her laugh, the way her eyes lit up at his stories, the pride in her voice when she called him Father. He clung to the fragile hope that a servant, a goat, a stray lamb, would cross the threshold first, a hope he knew was a lie. Then he heard it. First, a distant sound, carried on the wind. Then, clearer. It wasn't the wail of the defeated, but the rhythmic beat of tambourines. It was the sound of a party. All of Mizpah was celebrating the return of their hero, their deliverer. The music that should have warmed his heart filled him with a frozen dread. Their celebration was the prelude to his ruin. Every beat of the tambourine was a nail being hammered into his fate. From a hilltop he saw his house, the house he had built, the one place in the world that was truly his. The door was closed. For a desperate second, a spark of denial flared. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe the words of the vow were lost in the night, the fever dream of a terrified man. Maybe God, in his mercy, didn't take a fool's promise seriously. He held his breath, his heart hammering against his ribs. And the door opened. As if in a slow-motion nightmare, the figure that emerged was not a servant, not an animal. It was her, his daughter, his only child, dancing at the head of a line of women, her face alight with a smile of pure pride and joy. She played her tambourine, celebrating the victorious father coming home, never knowing her dance was a funeral march, and the hero she saluted was about to become the executioner of her happiness. Jephthah's world ground to a halt. The noise of the party turned to a dull, deafening roar. The blue sky, the smiling faces, the celebrating soldiers, it all dissolved into a blur of pain. The only thing sharp in the entire universe was her, his girl, running toward him, arms outstretched, love in her eyes. And he knew, with a certainty that crushed his soul, that God had delivered, and now he was collecting. A guttural sound, the cry of a wounded animal, tore from his throat. He didn't rush to embrace her. He ripped his own clothes, a sign of absolute mourning and despair. And then he screamed the words that sealed both their fates, words that were both a lament and a terrible sentence. "Oh, my daughter, you have brought me to my knees. You have become the instrument of my ruin, for I have made a vow to the Lord and I cannot go back." The music stopped cold. The smile on the girl's face withered, replaced by frightened confusion. She stopped a few feet from him, her tambourine slipping from her fingers and hitting the dirt with a dull thud. She saw her father's torn robes, the horror in his eyes, the agony that twisted his face into a mask of suffering. She didn't understand. He was the hero. They had won. "My father?" Her voice was a trembling whisper. His voice cracking with anguish, he told her of the vow, of the promise made in darkness, born of fear. "I have opened my mouth to the Lord," he repeated, as if to convince himself, "and I cannot go back." In that moment, his tragedy was complete. His honor, in keeping a promise God never demanded, was stronger than his love as a father. His faith, built on the foundation of a bargain, had constructed his own prison. And through this heart-wrenching scene, the heavens remained silent. There was no divine voice, no intervening angel. There was no substitute ram caught in the thicket, as there was for Abraham. God's only answer was the crushing silence. A silence that confirmed the victory Jephthah had demanded, but left him alone with the horrifying consequences of the price he himself had set. The military victory had become his most profound and desolate spiritual defeat. The battlefield around them fell silent. The soldiers, the elders, the women with their tambourines, all held their breath, witnesses to a tragedy they couldn't comprehend. The glory of victory had dissolved, replaced by the solemnity of an invisible altar. The attention of all Israel turned to the girl. The dust of her victory danced still on her feet, now standing before her broken father. Her face, a mirror of her soul, shifted from confusion to understanding, and from understanding to a calm that felt otherworldly. She took a step forward, her posture small but unshakable. Her voice didn't waver as she spoke, and her words were sharper to Jephthah's heart than any Ammonite sword. "My father," she said with desolate serenity, "if you have opened your mouth to the Lord, do to me according to what you have promised. After all, the Lord has given you vengeance on your enemies." In that instant, the bastard's daughter, the prostitute's granddaughter, displayed a faith more pure and noble than any leader in Israel. Her words brought Jephthah no relief. On the contrary, they were like salt in his gaping wound. Her grace illuminated the ugliness of his bargain. Her trust in God exposed his fear. He had expected pleading, tears, panic. Instead, he received a sacred submission that only deepened his agony. He wasn't just a grieving father. He was a shamed man, confronted by the holiness of the one he was about to destroy. Then she made a single request, her voice finally betraying a trace of her humanity and her loss. "Grant me only this," she said. "Let me go into the mountains for 2 months with my friends. There, we will mourn together, not my life, but my virginity." She didn't ask to escape the vow. She asked for time to grieve the life she would not live. The embrace of a husband, the weight of a child in her arms, the continuation of her line. She asked to weep for the future her father's vow had stolen. "Go." The word fell from Jephthah's mouth like a stone. He watched her walk away, followed by a silent procession of her companions, ascending toward the hills of Gilead. The victory he had craved now left him utterly alone. His house, once the symbol of his triumphant return, had become a mausoleum. His newfound power, the prize for his conquest, was a crown of ashes. His glory had become his curse. Far from the eyes of men, in the rocky solitude of the mountains, Jephthah's daughter found her sanctuary. There, the grief was not quiet. It was a deep lament, sung in unison with her friends, a ritual of farewell to the dreams of a lifetime. They wept not just for a person, but for all the generations that would not be born from her. It was a sacred act, a ceremony of pure sorrow, a dignified acceptance of a fate she did not choose but embraced with courage. Meanwhile, back in Mizpah, Jephthah lived his own exile, one deeper and more painful than Tob. He was the judge of Israel, the acclaimed leader, but every salute, every word of praise from the people was an echo of the price he had paid. He walked the empty rooms of his house, the silence amplified by the absence of his daughter's laugh. This was his spiritual turning point, not a repentance that changed the past, but a crushing acceptance of the consequences of his broken faith. He began to understand, in the bitterness of his solitude, the terrible lesson God was teaching him through silence. Salvation, grace, divine favor. They were not commodities. They couldn't be bought with impulsive promises or desperate bargains. God had given him the victory he asked for, but had allowed him to fall into the very trap his own lack of trust had built. The revelation wasn't a voice from heaven, but the echo in his empty house. The 2 months passed. From the mountain she returned. She was no longer the girl who danced, but a woman whose serenity was as beautiful as it was tragic. There was a resolve in her eyes, a peace that transcended fear. She had walked through her grief and emerged on the other side, ready. Her return was not a surrender, but the final act of an incomprehensible faith. She stood before her father. There was nothing left to say. The time for tears was over. The pact, sealed in the darkness of one man's doubt, would be fulfilled in the light of day, witnessed by the brave submission of one woman. And all of Israel, through this tragedy, would learn a lesson about the holiness of God and the danger of trying to put a price on what can only be received by grace. There was no public ritual, no grand ceremony. The scripture is stark, almost cruel in its simplicity. And he did with her according to his vow which he had made. The act itself is hidden behind these words, but its weight crushes the soul. It was an act of blind obedience to a foolish promise, a sacrifice made not to God, but to the wounded pride of a man who couldn't go back on his word. The terror isn't in what is seen, but in the silence that follows. The silence of a life cut short. In the aftermath, a different kind of silence fell over Mizpah. Not the silence of peace, but of bewilderment and horror. The victory over the Ammonites, once so celebrated, now tasted like ashes. The elders who had sought out Jephthah in Tob, who had promised him leadership, now stared at the ground, complicit in a tragedy they had set in motion. Israel's freedom had been bought with the innocent blood of their deliverer's daughter. That day was not forgotten. It became a scar on the nation's memory. The Bible says, and it became a custom in Israel. The story of Jephthah's vow was told from generation to generation, not as a tale of heroism but as a solemn warning, a lesson about the danger of a faith that tries to manipulate God, that mistakes desperation for devotion and stubbornness for integrity. Jephthah's personal tragedy became a collective trauma, and Jephthah ruled. He sat in the judge's seat, the place of highest honor in Gilead, the position he had demanded as payment. He judged the people's disputes, administered the law, kept the peace. He fulfilled his role with the same grim determination with which he had fulfilled his vow. He had everything he wanted: power, respect, a place in history. But every sunset found him in an empty house, with a throne that brought him no comfort, only the echo of a laugh he would never hear again. He became a man haunted by silence, the silence of God, who never spoke to him after that fateful vow, and the silence of his home, where there was once music and dancing. In his long nights as judge of Israel, he surely replayed every moment: the casting out, the summons, the fear before the battle, and above all, the vision of his daughter running to meet him. His 6 years of rule were not a reign but a long and lonely penance. But if Jephthah's legacy is one of tragedy, his daughter's is one of honor. The custom established in Israel wasn't just for mourning. The scriptures say that for 4 days every year, the daughters of Israel would go to lament or commemorate the daughter of Jephthah. It was an act of remembrance, a way of honoring the courage of a girl who faced the unthinkable with a grace her father lacked. The anonymous victim became an eternal symbol of innocent faith, consumed by blind zeal. Jephthah's true transformation didn't lead him to happiness, but to a wisdom born of the deepest pain. He learned, in the most brutal way imaginable, that God's favor is not a prize to be won in a wager. He understood that his desperate need for acceptance had led him to make an idol of his own word, his own honor. Perhaps he became a just judge for Israel, because no one knew the price of injustice and foolishness like he did. The mystery remains: how can Jephthah, the man of the terrible vow, be listed among the heroes of faith in the book of Hebrews? The answer, perhaps, lies in the complexity of God. The text honors the faith Jephthah had to march against the Ammonites, believing God could give victory to an outcast. God used his broken faith to save Israel, but he did not spare him the consequences of his actions. His story is a reminder that God can use flawed people, but the scars of their flaws remain. His 6 years of rule came to an end. The Bible doesn't say how he died, only that Jephthah the Gileadite judged Israel 6 years. Then he died and was buried in a town in Gilead. He was a man aged by grief, not by time, a leader who inspired fear, but not love, a king in his own lonely kingdom. He was finally laid to rest in the land he fought for, the same land that had cast him out. He had won his place, his name, his legacy, but he was buried as he began, alone, with no son or daughter to mourn at his grave or carry on his name. The story of Jephthah, the mighty and valiant, is a warning etched in stone, a whisper on the Gilead wind of a victory that cost everything. His tomb in Gilead is a monument to silence, a place of honor for the leader who saved Israel, but also a place of stillness, where no children tell their father's stories. Unlike David, whose legacy is the Psalms, or Abraham, whose descendants filled the earth, Jephthah's legacy is an uncomfortable question, a cautionary tale, whispered on the wind. A hero whose greatest victory was also his most crushing defeat. But what was the true tragedy of that day? Was it the death of an innocent girl, or the broken faith of a man so used to fighting that he didn't know how to simply receive? The deepest pain lies not in the sacrifice itself, but in the bargain that preceded it. A man so desperate for a sign, so needy for collateral, that he couldn't hear the voice of God, who had already clothed him with his spirit for the battle. The hardest truth, and perhaps the most liberating, is that God never asked for it. The law of Moses was explicit in its condemnation of human sacrifice, calling it an abomination. Jephthah, in his desperation and his likely ignorance of the depths of the law, offered God something he despised. It wasn't an act of supreme obedience, but a perversion of faith, born from the trauma and fear of being abandoned yet again. His entire life was a reaction to rejection, and in the end, he couldn't believe that God's favor could be different from man's, unconditional and free. He projected the transactional logic of earth onto heaven. Unable to accept grace, he tried to buy it. And the price he set himself was his own happiness, his own future, his own bloodline. Jephthah's story is, therefore, the Bible's most vivid portrait of the clash between human bargaining and divine grace. It is the tale of a man who tried to force open a door that God had already unlocked for him. It is a solemn reminder that faith is not a contract with clauses and guarantees, but a confident surrender, especially when silence is the only answer we get. And if we're honest, we all carry a piece of Jephthah in our souls. In our moments of greatest fear, don't we also try to strike deals with God? If you heal me, I promise I'll be a better person. If you get me out of this mess, I'll never doubt you again. We treat grace like a bonus for good behavior, rather than the unmerited gift it is. The path to a true faith, the one Jephthah's story points to through its own darkness, is the path of trust. It is believing in God's goodness even when we don't feel it. It is accepting His love without the neurotic need to prove we deserve it. It's understanding that His favor doesn't depend on the grandeur of our promises, but on the vastness of His mercy. Perhaps the most redemptive image in this whole story is that annual custom, the daughters of Israel going up to the mountains not just to weep, but to remember, to honor. In that communal act of grief and memory, they found a form of healing. They chose compassion over judgment, and in remembering the innocent faith of that girl, they found the strength to move forward. Jephthah's journey is a mirror to our own souls, reflecting our fears and our bargains. If this story has touched you in some way, share it with someone who might need to hear that they don't have to negotiate for God's love. Sometimes, the greatest act of faith is simply learning to trust the silence. Because in the end, the story of Jephthah is not just about what one man's broken faith can destroy, but also about what God's sovereign grace can redeem. He used a rejected, flawed, and wounded man to save a nation. And he left us his story, not so that we would condemn him, but so that in his tragedy, we might find the wisdom not to make the same mistakes, learning instead to rest in a love that cannot be bought.